Last week was a good lesson, I thought, of singing. I enjoyed that. And I was debating whether or not to present this lesson last week. And I'm glad I waited because I just felt like it was a good assembly and a good time to be able to sing together and to worship God together. But I did want to make a few comments about something that happened about a couple of weeks ago in our country. Some of the declarations that have been made that really do need to be addressed by Christians, at least to some degree. Last week, President Obama and Vice President Biden stepped out of the closet when they declared that they are in favor of homosexuals marrying one another. And I don't believe that anybody who's politically astute was really surprised by this. I mean, anybody who's kind of has their ear to the ground and kind of listens to talk radio or reads the political things understands that our president really has for a long time been very much in favor and very much in the corner of the homosexual people of our country. However, in spite of the fact that he came out in favor of this, there has been an outcry. Happily, there has been an outcry from many quarters of people who are disappointed at his declaration and who are disappointed at the direction our country is going with regard to homosexuality. To the chagrin of homosexuals and to the pollsters who are continually telling us that the majority of American people favor homosexual marriage through the only poll that really matters, and that is through the ballot box, 29 states have voted in favor of changing their constitutions to limit marriage to the union of one man and one woman. And I was looking at all these referendi, and most of them actually say one man, one woman, which, by the way, is a protection against polygamy. I mean, they were very careful in wording this, not only to make it so that homosexuals could not get married, but so that there would remain a monogamous state of marriage. And so they say one man and one woman, and I think we'll be having that problem later on as well in this country as our country becomes more pluralistic. The American people do not approve. They do not approve of redefining marriage to include homosexual couples, and I believe rightly so. I believe rightly so, for God has already defined marriage. He's already told us what marriage is, and He declared what marriage is from the very beginning when He made one woman for Adam. And Moses refers to that event, for this cause shall a man leave his father and his mother and shall cleave to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. Eve was made as a perfect companion, a companion that was perfectly suitable for Adam in every sort of way, emotionally and mentally, but also sexually as well. Now, when the apostles first went forth into the world with the gospel of grace, every type of sexual perversion existed during that time. And it was really approved of by the societies in which they went out in. For example, fornication, adultery, incest, pedophilia, homosexuality was all being practiced in the ancient world. These are not new things. You know, we sometimes think, oh, how awful of a state we live in. And I don't mean state of Vermont. I mean state condition we live in. How awful the state we live in. Because all these things are happening, but they've always gone on. They've always happened. And when Christianity first hit the scene, there was, all the world had all these kind of sins taking place. And to a great degree, the cultures in which these things were going on approved of it. They thought these things were just fine. There was nothing wrong with these things. And so when the gospel went out, the preachers had to deal with these things as they proclaimed the message of grace. In Plato's Symposium, for example, and he wrote this sometime before the New Testament times, but he makes this comment, and I'm going to quote what he says here. He talks about love between men and boys. And it was considered the most ideal course of nature. He sets it forth as a mentoring thing, as an affection. He says, I quote from the Symposium, in one of the Symposiums, in one of his dialogues, Lucian makes Licinius relate, it were better not to need marriage, but to follow Plato and Socrates and to be content with the love of boys. Now that was what the Greeks thought, or some of the Greeks thought, some of the enlightened thinkers of the time. time thought. It's better not to have marriage, but just have love between men and boys. He says, later on, he quotes Plato, or Socrates, as having said, "I am a lover of boys and wise in matters of love. What is your attitude to pretty boys?" he is asked. "Their kisses," he answers, "shall be the reward for the bravest after they have done some splendid, reckless deed." Now we read that and we're appalled. And we say, oh, this has been said and this is what was going on. I just want to illustrate, this is what the gospel went out into the world to have to confront right from the very beginning. They confronted this type of mentality where pedophilia and that sort of thing was going on. Regarding Rome, the British historian Edward Gibbon wrote, "Of the first 15 emperors, Claudius is the only one whose taste in love was entirely correct. Of Julius Caesar, one report says in his youth he was sleeping with the wives of some of the most important gentlemen in Rome and famous beauties of his time. Rumor whispered that he often slept with their husbands as well. And as with many ambitious men, beds were stepping stones to his career." And that's from Edward Gibbon in his histories. According to William Barclay, sexual purity was the one completely new virtue which Christianity introduced into the pagan world. This was no easy task, for there was no strong body of opinion against sexual immorality. To the Greco-Roman world, immorality in sexual matters was not immorality. It was the established custom and practice. And furthermore, prostitution was often associated with religion. Corinth and Ephesus were both noted for fornication associated with the temples of Aphrodite and Diana located in their cities. So just think of what he says. And this guy here is a biblical scholar, William Barclay. He said sexual purity was a completely new virtue which Christianity introduced into the pagan world. He says, to the Greco-Roman world, immorality in sexual matters was not immorality. Doesn't that sound like what it is today? You talk about the immorality of fornication and people look at you like you're nuts. Immorality, everybody's doing this. This is what everybody does. You talk about the immorality of homosexuality and people say, what do you mean immoral? What right do you have to pass judgment on us regarding these things? Well, the Greeks and the Romans of the first century, they also felt this way. There was no really anything that was immoral with regard to sex. All these things they did, and it was the established custom and practice to do these things. And again, it's important to realize that when immorality in sexual matters was not considered immoral, it was at that time that the gospel went out. It was at that time that the gospel confronted these immoralities and began to go forth with the proclamation of what Jesus Christ had on his mind and what he wanted men to do and to believe. They went forth into the world, to the whole world, preaching the gospel to every creature. And through their preaching, they taught the world, Jesus taught the world against all forms of sexual immorality, including fornication, adultery, and male and female homosexuality. They went forth into a world that was very hostile to this message, just like it is today. And because of their preaching and because of their being able to reason with people and to point out the truth on these issues, the truth won out, at least for a great many people. No, it's never been a time when these things were absent. There's always been fornicators and adulterers and homosexuals and pedophiles and all these kind of things. But people's mind began to change where after a while these things did go into the closet. And people weren't so free to practice them because the consensus of society began to be, well, this really is not a good thing. And it was because of the proclamation of the gospel of Christ that it got to be this way. It did take some time, but it did eventually happen. Turn, if you will, to Romans chapter 1. And what I want us to do is to just look at this passage this morning to some degree and to help us to understand why is it that Christians cannot say that we just in favor of just everybody getting married, even if it's to each other, or even if it's to the same sex, and we need to understand why we can't hold a position that it's okay for homosexuals to get married. And I believe that when we understand what God actually says about homosexuality, that we will understand that, well, if it's wrong, then how can that marriage make it right? And it can't. If it's wrong, how can marriage make it right? And why would we be willing to allow people who are doing something that is wrong, why would we want to somehow sanction it by marriage, which is really what they want us to do? In Romans chapter 1, beginning of verse 21, Paul here is talking about and tracing out the apostasy that had taken place in the world, where men were leaving the gospel, or leaving God, And he says, for even though they knew God, talking about the world, even though they knew God, they did not honor Him as God or give thanks, but they became futile in their speculations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools, and exchanged the glory of the incorruptible God for an image in the form of corruptible man, and birds, and four-footed animals, and crawly creatures. Therefore God gave them over to the lust of their hearts, to impurity, so that their bodies would be dishonored among them. For they exchanged the truth of God for a lie, and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. For this reason God gave them over to degrading passions. For their women exchanged the natural function for that which is unnatural. And in the same way also men abandoned the natural function of the woman, and burned in their desire toward one another, men with men, committing indecent acts, and receiving in their own persons the due penalty of their error. Regarding homosexuality, the Lord teaches us through the Apostle Paul here that as a result of exchanging the light for darkness, as a result of substituting the truth of God for a lie, because that had to take place first. As a result of doing that, God gave men and women over to degrading passions. That's the language that Paul uses. The NIV says shameful lusts. The ESV says dishonorable passions. And the Authorized Version of the American Standard says vile passions. However the phrase should be translated, it is obvious to those who are reading that the desires and the passions that Paul is talking about are dishonorable desires and passions, and they are indicative of God's judgment upon those who indulge them. Paul then gives an example of some of the degrading passions. And I think it's a mistake to read this middle section without keeping in mind that Paul concludes mentioning a whole lot of other sins. And we're going to touch on that later on. But he begins talking about these degrading things, this evil course that men were traveling on by talking about homosexuality. He gives an example of it. He first mentions, I believe, lesbianism or female homosexuality, describing clearly adult mutual lesbian activity. Look what he says here. He says in verse 26, for this reason God gave them over to degrading passion, for their women exchanged the natural function for that which is unnatural. He begins by talking about what these women had done. They exchanged the natural function. The NIV says, and I think they're right because this is what the context demands, the natural sexual function for that which he says is unnatural. That Paul is referring to homosexuality is clear from the way he links this verse with the next. Because look what he says, and in the same way also. And then he talks about male homosexuality. So it's clear he's not talking about just good feelings between women. He's talking about their sexual activity, abandoning the natural function for that which is unnatural. And he's talking about their lesbianism or their female homosexuality. And he talks about these things as well as the male homosexuality as being indecent, shameful, and all these kind of things we will see in verse 27. You know, there's a note of sadness that Paul brings out here that's really not found in the New American and even in the ESV, but it's found, I think, in the King James, the NIV, the King James and the NIV. There's an expression that is used here that is not translated, and the expression is the word even, for even. You know, if you remember the story of of Peter going to Antioch and refused to eat with the Gentiles. And Paul records that even Barnabas, and it's kind of said as an amazing thing, even Barnabas. Well, here it says, even the women. Even the women. Where you would expect women to have a higher standard of morality. And I tell you what, when I was growing up, my mother would talk about how disappointed she was of women trying to become like men. She said, why would they want to be like men? Their men have such low base standards in morality. And I tell you, when women become more like men, the men get worse. It's the women who hold up the moral standard among the men. And listen, ladies, that's an important thing to keep in mind. It's you who hold up the standard of morality. You demand, no, I am not going to do this, and this is wrong. And the men will follow suit. But you lower your standard, and men will act worse. Even the women, Paul says. Even the women were given over to these kind of things. Even they exchanged the natural function for that which is against nature. And he's talking about that which is unnatural. The natural sexual function is still known to these women. They knew what the natural sexual function was, but they chose to exchange it. And that's again an important thing to realize. He says they exchanged the natural function for that which is unnatural. They knew what it was, but they said no to it. The word unnatural, I think, is indeed defined by the context. He is referring to the way that God created human beings, male and female, and the sexual union that takes place between the man and the woman. This is what has been exchanged in this downward spiral that is taking place of sinfulness. God created woman with a natural sexual function. And when one rebels against God's truth and exchanges the truth for a lie, that lie impacts everything else that is in one's life. The natural function is exchanged for that which is against nature, and that is, it is unnatural in its created order. He's talking about nature in the sense of the way God made, or the way we are made. The man is made to be linked with the woman, and vice versa. The man is made to be linked with the woman and not to one another. I want to illustrate this. You know, and again, the struggle about a lesson like this is you don't want to be crude in an audience that's so mixed as this, but you want to be clear enough, because I tell you what, our kids are hearing this at school. Our kids are learning this in school. But let me just illustrate it like this. You know, the idea that some people have, well, if you can plug in something, everything's okay, you know, and all that. When I lived overseas in Ireland, anybody who's ever traveled overseas, maybe you've had this kind of experience. You bring your little adapters where you can stick something in a wall and plug in your machines. And you can plug in your adapter, and then you plug in your machine into the adapter. And if you're not careful, what will happen is a lot of times you go, oh no! Well, you were able to plug it in. It was able to fit in. But what happened was there's a charge difference there. And you've ruined what you had. There is a difference, 110 over here, 220 over there, it depends on where you travel, and it'll burn up your stuff. Just because you were able to plug it in didn't make it work, and didn't mean it was the right thing to do. And we have this idea that, well, if we can do this, then it must be okay, and no, it's not the case at all. It's not the case at all. I mean, just because you can plug in, it doesn't mean there's no danger, and it doesn't mean that it's going to work. It doesn't work. And that's just an illustration of what I'm talking about here. The word unnatural, like I said, is defined by the context. He is referring to the way God has created the males and the females, and He made them so that sexually they can be connected. Sexually they can be connected, and so that their sex will indeed result in offspring if the Lord so wills. Verse 27 continues the same thought, turning to male homosexuality. He says, in the same way also, men abandon the natural function. So as the women abandon the natural function, the natural sexual function for the unnatural, so the man abandon the natural function of the woman. God's intention in the sexual expression of His creatures is to be between a man and a woman, just as it was with Adam and with Eve. This is the natural sexual function, but these men abandoned it. They abandoned this. They left it to burn in their desires toward other men. The NIV says they were inflamed in their lust for others or one another. These desires were consuming desires. And such would point to, I believe, to an ongoing lifestyle. Not just a moment of debauchery where you kind of gave yourself into the passion, but this was an ongoing thing. An ongoing thing, a way of life. And the idea here is that these desires were ongoing, and furthermore, they were mutual. They were mutual. They were going both ways. One homosexual man desiring another and vice versa. And this is important because Paul is not speaking about coercive relationships. Very often when you hear homosexuals talk about these passages, because they have a problem with these passages, they like to call them clobber passages because they're clobbered by them every time this topic comes up. And I don't think we ought to clobber anybody. I think we ought to teach people and help people understand. But I tell you what, they have a problem with these verses. And they're saying, well, Paul is talking about coercive relationships, kind of like what took place when in Sodom and Gomorrah, where these these men of Sodom wanted to rape the angels, who they thought were just men. Coercive. They can't imagine there being a mutual satisfaction. But this is what Paul is saying. Men with men. I mean, they were desiring each other. They were seeking to satisfy one another. These were not coercive. These were men who were inflamed in their desire for one another. So he's speaking about homosexual relations that involve a mutual reciprocal affections. And as a result of this perversion, this male-female homosexuality, Paul goes on to say they receive in their persons, he says, they receive in themselves the due penalty of their error. Men and women cannot expect to engage in deviant, unnatural activity without receiving the due penalty of their error. There are at least three things that we can know from these verses. And one thing which I don't think we can know. But the three things we can know are that first, the due penalty that Paul is talking about here, that they receive is for the indecent acts. It's for the indecent acts of men and women who engage in the natural, or who exchange, the natural sexual function for the natural ones. That's the first thing we can know. This is what they receive because of this way of life. Number two, this is the due penalty of their punishment. We don't use this word too often, but the due penalty simply means, fitting, proper, right. The rightful punishment, the fitting penalty, the proper penalty. And this is the proper penalty for turning from the natural sexual function to that which is unnatural. And the third thing we can know is that the word error is not simply a miscalculation, like I commit an error. You know, you make a miscalculation and kind of minimize what you've done. Like in a math test, I made an error. This is not what this word error means. The Greek word plane or planie means to wander or to be misled out of the right path. And therefore, a better rendering of this term in this context is perversion. And this is how the NIV renders it. The NIV says the due penalty for their perversion. And that's the idea behind the word error. Now, the thing we can't know about this is what is the due penalty of their error. We don't know what that is. Obviously, there are people who speculate, and I'm going to do a little bit of speculating and give you some things that it may be. But I don't think any of us can necessarily be dogmatic about it. For example, it may be, as one man pointed out, it may be that that this penalty is hell. The due penalty of the error is hell. And because that is the due penalty of any rebel, then that could be the right answer. That could be the right answer. It may be that he's simply saying that they will receive hell because of what they've done. And that may be what he's talking about. Again, it could be so, because I do know that all rebels will eventually end up there who are unrepentant. Others have said that it's the diseases associated with this and other sexual perversions. Again, it may be, because disease is associated with this. And I'm not just talking about AIDS. There are a lot of diseases that are really associated with sexuality. Not just homosexuality, but with sexuality. Those people who practice sex outside of marriage are opening themselves up to all kinds of disease. When I was growing up, I could name gonorrhea and syphilis. And there may have been some others, but today there's a list and lists of things that people get because of their sexual promiscuity. So it could be disease. It could be some disease, and don't be fooled into thinking that lesbians can't get sexually transmitted disease. They most certainly can. Just go to the internet and say disease is associated with lesbianism, and you'll see they can, and they do. Maybe not as readily as the males do, but they surely can get them. The other thing that I'm more inclined to kind of think is what he's talking about here is what some of the early commentators said about this verse. John Chrysostom, who was one of the early, they call him the church fathers, but he was a leading commentator of the early church, and he said that the penalty referred to is, in this passage, is the sexual perversion itself. It becomes a cycle. The sin degrading the sinner who is trapped by his or her own lust. And so the idea is that he becomes entrapped in this way of life. And he just can't break out of it. Or at least not without great difficulty. And let me just say, from what I've been able to see, that really is the way it is. It takes a lot of effort for people who get involved in these things to ever get out. It doesn't mean they can't. And we're going to see later on that they can. In 1 Corinthians, Paul talks about homosexuals in the past tense. Such were some of you. So it can be done. But I tell you, it becomes such an ingrained thing. And I think what he says here, when he talks about it, he says it's the sexual perversion itself. It becomes a cycle, the sin, degrading the sinner who is trapped by his or her own lust. And again, that may be a possibility. And that's really the one that I am inclined to believe, though I would, of course, not be dogmatic. And I think we just need to be aware God has not told us what that is. It could be all of these things in some degree or the other. But that is the result. That is God's view of this. These verses make it evident that God is the one who declares that male and female homosexuality are unnatural and indecent acts. And as you might imagine, these verses are painful for male and female homosexuals to read, especially to the females, because this is the only place in the New Testament, the only passage I think in the Bible where lesbianism is specifically addressed, or female homosexuality is specifically addressed. Again, the question is, what do homosexuals and homophiles think about, or what do they do when they come across these verses? And I've already told you one thing they do, and they have a lot of things to say about these verses, because they figured if they can just say a lot of different things that one of them may stick. But they have a lot of answers. But one answer we've already talked about is that these were unloving relationships, and so these were coercive relationships, and of course, who would think that is right? The other thing they say is that these people weren't really homosexuals. I'm serious. They say Paul is not talking about real homosexuals. A fellow called John Boswell, excuse me, John, if he's ever listened to this. We have a friend named John Bosworth. But John Boswell makes this point in his book, Christianity, Social Tolerance, and Homosexuality. And this came out in 1980. And commenting on these passages, he says this. He says, on the other hand, it should be recognized that the point of the passage is not to stigmatize sexual behavior of any sort, but to condemn the Gentiles for their great or general infidelity, whatever that means. The reference to homosexuality is simply a mundane analogy to this theological sin. It is patently not the crux of the argument. What is even more important, and this is his most important point, the persons Paul condemns are manifestly not homosexuals. What he derogates are homosexual acts committed by apparently heterosexual persons who have rejected their calling, gotten off the true path they were once on, and it would completely undermine the thrust of the argument if the persons in question were not naturally inclined to the opposite sex in the same way that they are naturally inclined to monotheism. So he's saying here these people weren't really homosexuals. They are heterosexuals who want to experiment with homosexuality. And when you say, well, that's just one guy, let me tell you, I have another book. Another book that was sent to me by my son, The Children Are Free, by Jeff Miner and John Taylor, and they make the same argument. They say the model of homosexual behavior Paul was addressing here is explicitly associated with idol worship, probably temple prostitution, and with people who, in an unbridled search for pleasure, or because of religious rituals associated with their idolatry, broke away from their natural sexual orientation, participating in promiscuous sex with anyone available. There are no doubt modern people who engage in homosexual sex for similar reasons, similar to those identified in Romans 1. If someone began with a clear heterosexual orientation but rejected God and began experimenting with gay sex simply as a way of experiencing a new set of pleasures, then this passage may apply to that person. So what they're saying is this verse doesn't refer to homosexuals. It refers to people who are heterosexuals who want to experiment. You know, let me tell you something. That is just no way to treat the Word of God. And that's what we call revisionism. And sometimes we have people who try to revise American history or world history. And that's one thing. I mean, maybe I wouldn't be so upset about that. But this is the Word of God. And for people to come along and say, well, Paul really wasn't talking about genuine homosexuals. Just those who were dabbling in it, who were heterosexuals who were dabbling in it. That is what they say this verse means. And that is not an uncommon view. I've given two sources. One is greater than the other. The first source was the most authoritative. But it just shows you that others like him who also write books and defend homosexuality will make that same argument. There is no question that Paul associates homosexuality with turning away from God to worship created things. I mean, there's no doubt that he is talking about people who turn away from God to serve something that's not God. That's the whole context. These things have to happen first before these other things happen. I mean, there's no question about that. A person who has a true view of God won't act this way. That's just the way it is. He won't act this way. And he won't do the other things that are mentioned at the end of the chapter either. So there has to be a general turning away from God. All sins start with that. Idolatry would be included in this turning away, but not exclusively. For all sin, listen carefully, all sin, including homosexuality, dethrones God. It dethrones God and enthrones man, the creature. But when men like Boswell read into these verses, when they say that because these men and women chose this activity, and they make a big point on that because they chose this activity, then it follows that they are not true homosexuals. That's what they are saying. Well, let me just say the hidden and the false assumption of John and these other two men that I mentioned is that homosexuals do not choose to engage in the activities they do. They say homosexuals are what they are. They're what they are. And they did not choose, and they would not choose to be a homosexual. But such is obviously a far, far from the apostles' meaning, let alone the truth. Let alone the truth that we actually know about this. The words of Romans 1 applies to anyone engaging in homosexual activities or desires, and this is exactly what we see today in the modern homosexual movement. People giving themselves over to these things, choosing this thing. Somebody said, why would a man choose a lifestyle that's so unpopular? For the same reason he chooses to be a drunk. For the same reason you choose to be a drug addict. Who would choose to live in the gutter? But when you have a certain life course and you have a certain desire, you've made the choice. Nobody would choose to live in the gutter, but when you start walking down that road, that is where it will lead. And somebody say, I didn't choose to be a lifestyle that everybody hates. Well, you did. You chose to take that first step. Nobody made you to do this, and God did not make you a homosexual. God did not do that. That would be an unnatural thing to be a homosexual, and God would not make you that way. Paul's argument in these verses is that there is something called the natural sexual function of the man and the woman. He is speaking of the way God created the male and female. They were created to fit together sexually. Men have sex with men and women have sex with women. Well, that's unnatural. This is the last thing the homosexuals will ever want to hear the Bible to say. But this is what it says in Romans chapter 1. And what homosexuals do with one another is most certainly unnatural in the nature of things. And they may say, I want to do this. It's my nature. But we're talking about if they want to prove that it's natural, they need to prove it's natural in every way, which they cannot do. I cannot do. You know, I have no doubt that if we allow homosexual marriages to go through in this country, I know it's happened here in Vermont already, but I mean, if it really takes place where the people vote for this, I have no doubt that allowing homosexuals to marry will undermine marriage. It will undermine marriage. It will, and let me just put it this way, it will further erode marriages. That's probably what I ought to say. But I would have you know that there is a greater threat for eroding marriage than homosexual marriages. Only about 3.5% of the people are homosexuals in this country. So they're not going, and not everybody who's a homosexual wants to get married. So it's going to be a very, very small amount of people who ever do get married if it ever does become the normal thing for our country to allow this. But there are other greater threats to marriage than that. Sexual promiscuity, from a heterosexual standpoint, is a greater threat to marriage than homosexuality and homosexual marriages. Turn, if you will, to Hebrews chapter 3 and 13 and verse 14. In Hebrews 13 and verse 14, the Apostle Paul writes, marriage is to be held in honor among all, and the marriage bed to be undefiled, for fornicators and adulterers God will judge. Paul commands that marriage is to be held in honor. And then he tells us two things that dishonor it. Two things that dishonor it. He says fornication and adultery dishonor marriage. When a person feels that they can have sex outside of marriage, why would they want to get married? I've never understood this, ladies. And again, I don't want to be crude, and I don't think this is crude, but it illustrates my point. Why would a person want to buy the cow when he can get the milk for free? And we all understand that. And there are some women who say, I don't know why he didn't marry me. Well, why would he? Why would he want to marry you? He gets everything he wants for nothing, without the commitment. And it's undermining marriage. When a man can have sex without marriage, without being committed to one woman, why would he want to get married? It undermines it. It undermines it terribly. And another thing that undermines it is adultery. When we start cheating on one another, that undermines marriage. These verses teach that marriage is dishonored through fornication as well as adultery. And it also teaches that both these things defile the bed, and God will judge those who do these things. What we really need to be preaching on is not so much about homosexuality and marriage. Oh, we need to talk about that when it comes up, because it is a biblical topic. But what we really need to be dealing with is the need of sexual purity, full stop. Sexual purity, full stop. Because when we feel that we can have the sex outside of marriage, we are undermining marriage. And one other thing, divorce is the greater threat to marriage than homosexual marriages. in our society, there's a figure that's thrown out, 50% of all marriages end in divorce. It's not quite that high. It's more like 40 when you consider first-time marriages. When you start taking other marriages, then it becomes even higher than 50. But divorce and remarriage, or divorce, excuse me, is a threat against marriage. It undermines marriage. Jesus said, and the Bible teaches, that marriage is supposed to be a lifetime commitment. When Jesus was asked in Matthew 19 about can a man divorce his wife for any reason at all, Jesus responds by saying, well, what is written? You know, he goes back to what is written. Let's look at the verse here real quick. He said, have you not read in verse 4, He who created them from the beginning made them male and female, and he said, for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and shall be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let no man separate. So can you get a divorce for any reason at all? And the answer is no. What God has joined together, let no man separate. And then they ask him, well, what about Moses? What about his command? And he did not give a command. Moses gave permission. And what they said was, and what they referred to is, why did Moses command to give her a certificate of divorce and send her away? And he said, because of your hardness of heart, Moses permitted this. This was not God's will, but it was permitted. He said, but from the beginning, it has not been this way. He says, and then he goes on and he says in verse 9, I say to you, whoever divorces his wife, except for immorality, and marries another woman, commits adultery. What really undermines marriage, and I am a Rush Limbaugh fan, but he's a man that's been married 2 or 3, maybe 4 times, maybe. And I really am a physical conservative, but when I have somebody like Newt Gingrich get up there and try to defend marriage, and I'm thinking, good grief. Because that man has been divorced twice under horrible circumstances where he just cheated on his mates. And I hear these kind of people defending marriage, it embarrasses me. I'm embarrassed by it. And I have to make an apology for that kind of stuff. I don't agree with that. I mean, these people are wrong. And they say, well, you think they're hypocrites? I think they are hypocrites. In many respects, because what they're doing, and they're not helping the cause by defending it. It's like having a drunk, stand in front and advertise your store. I mean, is that going to help people come in? Having somebody, no. I mean, people are going to look at that guy and say, I don't want to go in there. And these kind of things undermine marriage. Divorce is evil. And at least half the people who divorce have no right to ever remarry again. And if they do remarry again, they're committing adultery. And that undermines marriage. Let me tell you, we need to strengthen marriage. And we've had lessons on this, and that's why I didn't want to just spend a whole lot of time on it. But we need to strengthen our marriages. And we strengthen our marriages by teaching what's right, the right place for sex, the right place for that kind of activity to take place, and talk about it in a good, glowing terms, that it's good and wonderful and right. And it's evil everywhere else. Talk about it. Tell your children about these things. And then having good marriages, where you and your wife are working together. And no marriage is going to be perfect. There's no marriage where there won't be any conflict ever. But show your kids how to resolve conflict. Where you talk about it, and then you pray together, and you be reconciled together. And you show them, because they're going to need help, and they're going to need to remember what mom and dad did whenever they had conflict. It's a teaching moment for everybody, because that's what's going to happen in marriage, and we need to do that sort of thing. Marriage needs to be strengthened. Homosexual marriages, well, we ought not to have them, and we who are Christians ought not to be apologetic and saying, no, I'm against it.